Today we have a crazy story of revenge against a nosy college landlord. We'll get into that in a bit, but first, how my friends almost took me for everything I owned. I, male 21, should have known better than to trust either one of the so-called friends that I'd surrounded myself with at the time. On a normal enough day, I never would have imagined that my friend group, which consisted of the only set of people I had made a tight bond with, would be the group that would have backstabbed me. And all because of what? Their greed, jealousy, and whatnot? I don't think if there was, or rather, if there is anyone that would have been in the same situation that I was, that would have taken a different or alternate route. Let me take you right back to the very beginning so as to provide a more in-depth analysis of my story and what events played out that led me to certain actions which some would consider unwarranted and brass in a way. Basically, for as long as I can remember, I have always been the black sheep of my family. This was attributed to the fact that I was not as intellectually outstanding as my siblings, and this was something that my parents were initially placing a strong sense of attention to. Every other member of our family either picked up interest in law, medicine, or engineering. Basically, each and every other member of my family, expanded family inclusive, were all in respectable and reputable fields of study and profession, and there I was, the only oddball in the entire family. I was quite literally the only member of my family that wasn't all that interested in going to school, not to even talk of picking a certain discipline, and a reputable one at that. This was not because of the fact that my parents weren't about to provide me with the opportunity to do so, as it was quite the opposite actually. In fact, they provided me with a large variety of options, and I was meant to take my pick. But none of the things my parents wanted me to do was actually what I had in mind. The one thing I really enjoyed doing, and I even had the passion and zeal for, was building applications, programming, building top-notch websites from scratch. And all of these I learned on my own. This was the area I was quite refined in, and I could say there were few people of my age group, and even of higher statuses, that would completely dominate me in that field. It was where I really was the most confident in. But this didn't sit right and well with my parents, and ultimately my entire family, as it was seeming like I was attempting to stray away from my family's tradition. I could have cared less about what my family thought about what it was I wanted to do with my life, and it got to a certain point where I was almost cut from the entire family. But thankfully, due to the compassionate nature of my beloved mother, who was a neurosurgeon, she made great success in attempting to pacify my family, and ultimately my father, who was the one person that didn't support my career choice, and they finally decided to give me a chance to pursue my dreams and do what it was that I really wanted, and they also promised to be there for me whenever I needed them. The events that happened on this very day was what really touched my heart and made me believe in my family again. However, right after that incident, I had just then realized that I actually didn't want to be indebted to my family at all, as it would ultimately seem like a means for them to hang over my head if eventually what I'd planned for the next few years doesn't work out. You could be asking how I would think so, seeing as my entire family had just given me the go-ahead to continue with my passion and all, but I can tell you with almost absolute certainty that they definitely didn't say all that they did from a place of sincerity. In fact, some of them were actually already making reserved plans for when I would eventually fail. And so, to further the project I was working on at the time, I had to turn to my friends, whom I'd known for quite a while now. We all met each other when we were in high school, and out of our friend group at the time, I was the only one who didn't have the full support of my family, but I had their consent. I had quite a lot of business ideas, programming plans, and also application ideas. But the only problem at the time was the financial capacity to carry the burden of every single thing I wanted to do. What I had planned was meant to be a 2-year plan, which was supposed to progress slowly and steadily, considering that there is sufficient enough funds. But even after my friends had contributed to my work, I was still unable to meet up with what it was I wanted to. And ultimately, I'd already agreed to give them back considerably when what I was building for myself had gotten to a reputable stage. At the time, I never knew that my friends were only giving me their financial aid with the hope that they were going to collect more than the amount they had given when I wasn't able to pay back my folks, as they knew I was pretty loaded in the background. And there was quite literally nothing I could have achieved with this plan of mine. But I didn't know this at the time, because for one, they were still wearing their masks around me. Anyways, the next year or so was quite literally the toughest of my entire life. It was that time where I felt like I needed all the support I could get, and there was quite literally no one there to offer said help. Also, it should be noted that my family was readily available and willing to help me succeed, but I was just the stubborn one, unwilling to accept help from anyone related to me by blood. And then, when it had seemed like things were about to quite literally go under, my siblings came to my rescue and provided every single thing, finance, and resource I needed. And they even offered their services as a means to help me meet up with the deadline I'd set for myself. Right at that very moment, I really felt thankful for the kind of support I was receiving from my family, and it really made me realize that I was really thinking so lowly of my family, and I didn't give them as much credit as they deserved. Thankfully, I was able to meet up with the deadline, as it would have most definitely have been detrimental to everything I was working on building right then and there. Following the events that had happened the second year where I got the support of my family, I had already gotten even considerable contributions to my works from external sources and grants, and I was then finally able to pay back every single one of my friends that had apparently offered their support to me back then. But to my greatest surprise, none of them were willing to collect their payment at this time, as they were all insistent on totally forgoing the debt I'd owed them. After many days of trying to figure out why they weren't willing to collect their payments back and all, I kind of guessed what they were after. But at the time, it was only speculations, and I couldn't act on speculations alone, not with my then friends. After the 3-year period was up, I was finally able to launch my program, and almost instantaneously, I was able to secure a buyer who was willing and ready to purchase my program for more than 18 times its original price, as it was auctioned out to the highest bidder. It was a really insane moment, as I couldn't even believe my eyes the amount I'd gotten for this particular work of mine. It was enough to allow me and my family to live off the rest of our lives without ever having to worry about finances and all again. Not like we weren't well off from the get-go and all. I really needed to celebrate with my family and all. This was my first achievement amongst many others. Almost immediately, I wanted to show loyalty and sincerity to my family, and I immediately put everything I had owned and had gotten at the time under my family's name. This was just my way of telling and showing my parents that even though I wasn't following the path they had always wanted me to, I was still going to be successful regardless. And this was because I was doing what I truly enjoyed doing, what I had passion for. My father didn't show it at the time, but I knew that he was truly proud of the man I had become and what I'd achieved for myself and the respect and recognition I'd brought to my family name. Anyways, one would think that this is where I would draw the line, seeing as I had nothing else to work for and all, but it was quite the opposite literally, as I had many more ideas in mind and I was willing and ready to get started on every single one of them. Within the next few years, I had already sold a couple more programs, and I could proudly boast of having accumulated generational wealth alongside my family's fortune. When everything had seemed like there was quite literally nothing that could go wrong, then came the wolves. And by wolves, I mean my so-called friends from way back. They had come back to collect on what they had initially refused and turned down a couple of years back. Apparently, they thought that when I was already well made, they had a means to leverage quite a huge sum of funds from me, as they were looking to quite literally take everything I owned and all. But almost as if I'd guessed that this day was going to come sooner or later, I was already well prepared. At this time, I already knew that they were just looking to leech off of me back then, as they were seriously anticipating my failures on my first project. Unbeknownst to them, I had already written everything I owned and was worth in my family's name, in the hopes of securing everything I'd worked for. They tried approaching me peacefully at first to cash in on their so-called investment or debt, if you may, but I was unwilling to attend to any of their requests. And almost immediately, they sued me after pulling up a contractual document, which was totally fabricated by the way, and in it, it stated that in the instance where one party refuses to fulfill his or her end of the contract, the party in violation was to tender 80% of everything said part was worth and in possession of. My signature on that contract was totally fabricated, but it was done so perfectly well that there was nothing I could say that would counter that. but I wasn't scared one single bit, as I knew what measures I'd already put in place. When the court took a peek into the assets I owned, there was nothing they could do but dismiss the case, as at the time, I was worth nothing. After foiling their plans, I decided to get back at them by employing the services of my brother, who was a lawyer, a very reputable one at that. After briefly explaining the whole situation and how they had drafted a contract to take me for everything I owned, he assured me that they were going to get what they deserved, and in the blink of an eye, they were charged with various counts of financial fraud, amongst others, and their sentences weren't quite as severe as I had hoped, but I can say with almost certainty that they got what they deserved for trying to pull a fast one on me. I just have to say, it's a pretty bold move to make your big payday happen and then just immediately move it all right into like a family trust account? Some kind of estate where like all of a sudden it's locked up for like the rest of your life and your family can have some of it. It just gets so wrapped up, there's literally no way for anybody else to get their hands on it. I mean, really, it was a weird financial decision that ended up being actually pretty darn lucky. Our next story is my cheating partner. My girlfriend, female 25, of 6 years, cheated on me, male 28, with some random dudes. And I say random dudes because she quite literally cheated on me with not one, not two, but 3 different guys, which was basically the height of anything she could have done that would have hurt me this bad. And I decided to pay her back in the same coin by cheating on her with every single woman that was in her life, ranging from her mother to her sister, then her best friends, and even one of her distant cousins who came to visit her for the holidays. And I do not regret my actions, not one single bit. I know for a fact that I've always been faithful to my girlfriend right from the very moment when we got into a relationship. That was about 6 years ago. But we had known each other to quite the extent before then, and this was due to the fact that we both lived in the same neighborhood, and we basically grew up living across from each other on the street. I literally grew up on the street, but her family, on the other hand, had never been in one place for quite a long time. However, upon moving into the neighborhood, they had a change of heart, and decided that this was where they wanted to finally settle down for real. And they did so, even till date. And just as you would expect, the following week after I'd come to know of her existence, I had this certain masculine urge to talk to her and basically get to know her, but I was quite the introvert at the time, and proper conversation couldn't ensue between the both of us, not until we were both in high school. This was the time of my life where I was the most influenced by my friends, and not in the bad way or in the way you might be thinking, but I was basically in a friend group where we all pushed each other to be the best versions of ourselves. And it wasn't majorly limited to the gaming sessions we all jointly had immediately after school, but also in our everyday lives. The person I was the closest to in my friend group was Nathaniel, or Big Nat, as we usually called him. He was the one who usually coordinated the activities that we were going to engage in as a group. And he was the one that noticed first, out of my entire friend group, that I had a certain way I felt towards her. Let's call her Emily for future references. Emily was quite the spectacle. She was unique in every single way. Her mannerisms and all that were quite literally of a whole different level. One would even think that she was from a different social background than every single one of us. But the only thing I liked the most about her was the fact that her humility was one of the distinctive features of her that made her a truly admirable person. Big Nat had already realized that I had feelings for her and was even urging me to act on them. As he usually said to our group, "You only live once, as this is the only life we get." I thought long and hard on about what he had to say to me that day, and then that was when I decided I was going to act on it. And I just simply sought the perfect opportunity to approach her, which I did, and engaging and maintaining a conversation with her was quite seamless, as she was exceptionally receptive and her voice was so calming that I didn't have to think twice about what I needed to say, conversation starters and all. She was really open with me, considering that was our very first conversation. After our first conversation, I started to like the kind of person she was even more, because she had greatly exceeded my preconceived expectations of her, and I truly wanted to become something more with her. But at the time, it was still too early. I just wanted to make it known that right from the very beginning, I already had the intention of making her my special person, and I wasn't looking to play around while I was with her. We were officially in a relationship after about a whole month of back and forth talking, which basically involved the both of us getting to know each other in depth, as I made my intentions known to her from the very beginning, and surprisingly, she admitted to finding me attractive and intellectual enough for me to get a chance. I got to know quite a few things about her, even after living across the street from her for almost 5 years. The one thing I got to find out about her was the fact that she had an elder sister, who was apparently considered the black sheep of the family, and this big sister of hers is apparently the irresponsible one, as by the time she was done with high school, she found herself already with a child, and due to the fact that she was really promiscuous, she couldn't properly identify the one responsible for the child, and thus her parents considered her a true failure, and even tried to distance her from her younger sister, as they truly lost all hope for redemption for their daughter when they found out that even during the pregnancy and all, she was still engaging in immoral acts. When she was explaining the whole situation to me, it truly seemed like this sister of hers was really up to no good as a person. And it was probably the right idea, the fact that her parents tried to distance her from her younger sister and all, but I guess they couldn't do so completely, as she would have been left without a support system to cater for herself and for her baby, and so they got a place for her, quite a distance from their residence. Now fast forward a little bit, Emily and I had already graduated from high school. We had both gotten admitted into the various colleges of our choice, and life was really going fine for the both of us, most especially our relationship. We were both still going strong, and at the time, our relationship was just a little bit over 4 years. This was when, or rather, where the problems began. For starters, our relationship at the time was long distance due to the fact that we were both in different regions at the time. But this didn't stop us one single bit, as we were both prepared for this moment and all. And the one reason why I was against long distance, and the one problem most people have with long distance, is the fact that you're not always physically there to know what your partners are doing. I made my concerns known to her, and she assured me right then and there that everything was going to be alright, as she was going to be 100% faithful and there was nothing else she would want in the world other than to be with me. I realized that this truly goes to show how much she really loved me and the lengths she was willing to go for us. But even after this, I was still feeling quite uneasy until my very good friend, Big Nat, informed me that his family were trying to secure a studentship position for him over at the same college where Emily was. And this just seemed like my go-ahead and reassuring sign to let things play their course. I didn't know what was going on with Emily at the time that she was in school, but one thing I knew for a fact was that she most definitely was not the type to even let me down. And I didn't make it known to her, but Big Nat had already assured me that he was going to keep tabs on her and all. I know this was a wrong move and all, but it was just how I was feeling, and how insecure I was about the whole long distance thing. Surely there was nothing wrong and absolutely nothing going on with her when she was in school. This was the case for quite a while, until I'd received the one news I'd been dreading for quite a while, and it came in the worst possible form ever. So on this very day, Big Nat brought it to my attention that he was going to be at a party that night, and that he might be unreachable for quite a while, but he would be available from the next morning, and I had no problem with that. But later on that same night, when he was supposed to be at a party, he sent a text to ask my Emily where she was, and I asked why he wanted me to ask so suddenly, and he just urged me to ask her with a serious tone, and I did. She told me she was at the library with friends as she had a test coming up, and she was not prepared one single bit. I forwarded her response to Big Nat, and he instantly sent me a picture and some videos of her in the same party that he was. He also told me that they were about to play a game, and he would give me the full details of what she was doing. I waited patiently as I was still trying to fathom what was going on, and after waiting for almost about an hour, a video came in, which was about 45 minutes long. And in the video, I saw a couple of guys taking her into another room as she was dared to do something with them, and after quite a while, the guys started coming out of the room one by one, all sweating profusely and shirtless. She came out last, looking exhausted and all. I was broken. I wouldn't say I was expecting this, but I had a feeling that long distance was going to be quite the problem for either party. But still, the scene that had just unfolded right there in front of me was one that I couldn't believe. I was in a state of shock for quite a while. That was until I began getting strong feelings of rage and all. Then I just made up my mind there and then to ask her about that night. And surely enough, like you could have guessed, she denied that night ever happening. And I wanted to show her the evidence I had, but I had a better idea. I wanted her to feel what I was feeling at that moment. And so I sought out the one thing that could have gotten her to the level of feelings I was at the time. I found out that her mother was on a dating app for matured ladies, and I instantly knew what I had to do. It honestly took quite a while to conquer that hurdle, but when I finally did, this was only made possible because of the fact that I'm really good looking, with quite the physical features for my age, and also the fact that my place wasn't quite the distance from home. After her mother, I didn't feel like I was getting better. And so, I had the ingenious idea of moving on over to other girls in her household. This was also quite easy because I'd already broken through the front door, and so everything was just mine for the taking. And then one very day, right as she told me she was heading back home, I decided to let her catch me in the act, with her mother, no less. And I wouldn't want to go too far, but you can almost guess her reaction when she walked in on me and her mother being intimate with each other. This definitely traumatized her, and I felt a sense of satisfaction. We argued back and forth after this, but after showing her the video evidence I had of her, she simply broke down. And this was when I knew I was successful. So I get it, like OP was fueled with rage and whatnot, but when you're fueled with rage that you can manage to make time to visit your partner's house and sleep with their mom, my question turns to why did things seem so long distance? I guess OP was just like, screw it, I'll drive the 100 miles or whatever just to get revenge. Our next story is the nosy landlord I met in college. When I was younger, I lived in a beautiful suburb in Texas with my parents before I moved away to college. However, there were a couple of unpleasant experiences we had with a landlord who was both insensitive and callous. But the story I'd like to recount is that of another landlord who stood as a father figure to me when I was in college. When I got into college, I shared a room with a childhood friend who was rounding off college at the time. He accommodated me warmly, so I didn't see the need to get a new apartment when he finally graduated from college. I decided to stay at the apartment since I liked it there. The first encounter I had with the landlord, Mr. S, as he was fondly referred to around the neighborhood, was both hilarious and memorable. He told me he doesn't entertain drug abuse or any illicit behavior or any type within his property. He said if I was a bad boy, I should better hide it from him. I found myself chuckling as I told him he was a lucky man since all I had to show him was how well I'd been raised. That conversation brought me close to Mr. S, and I quickly saw a father figure in him. I had a good time occupying his apartment until he began to show me some parts of him I didn't like, which was mostly obvious in my final days in college. Even though he was a kind man, he could come across as nosy and annoying simultaneously. One time I brought a couple of friends home for dinner. Then I ran into him while trying to vacuum the trash, and I could see the look on his face was unwelcoming. I wondered why he looked so upset. I walked up to him to ask if he needed any help, but he gave me a dismissive look, more like "don't come close to me" kind of a look. I was hurt, as I only wanted to be sure he was okay. I forgave him because I thought he was my friend. The next day I met him at the driveway and I thought to ask if he felt better. Then he said, "I do not like it when you bring friends over to blast music all over the neighborhood." Just when I was about to ask him what he was talking about, he entered his car and drove off into the highway. I stood there for some time, stunned and too shocked to speak. I became really worried for the man because I thought whatever was upsetting him must be a big deal, as I'd never seen him in that manner before. Then I tried my best to talk to Mr. S later. He had been a good friend to me after all, and I wanted us to be on a good page again. Mr. S told me that he wasn't pleased with the number of friends I brought home 2 days before. They played loud music and they looked like people who could corrupt me. I looked at him closely, even though I knew he had already lost me at the "corrupt me" statement. I felt Mr. S was beginning to take his fatherly role too far. It was disgusting to me that he wanted to control everything, and he seemed to have escaped the fact that I was an adult. My friend had told me that Mr. S was a loner who kept to himself. Initially, both my friend and I didn't allow friends into our apartment because we didn't want to see Mr. S frowning the next morning. But I was in my graduating year of school and having a little fun won't hurt. I left Mr. S without apologizing for bringing my friends to my apartment. If he was a loner, I was okay with it, but I wasn't going to allow him to turn me into a loner too. He was surprised that I didn't apologize like I always did in the past, just like I apologized in the past for bringing my girlfriend to my apartment. I remember the way he frowned and called me aside almost immediately he saw us. He warned me not to sin and to remember that my primary objective for being in college was to study. I had believed him then, and I was gullible enough to take my girlfriend to a restaurant instead. That was the end of that relationship. I had allowed Mr. S to have his way on different occasions. First, because my friend did that before he left the apartment, and secondly, because I considered him a father figure since my parents were far away. After those encounters I had with Mr. S, I had expected that he would give me a quit notice. But to my surprise, he carried on with me just fine. But I didn't know Mr. S had his plans that he hid under his sleeves. Just when I thought we were good and fine, Mr. S woke up one morning and told me he wouldn't want me to renew my rent for the next month. I looked at him closely and I wasn't sure what response to give him at that point. The only thought that raved in my mind was how wicked Mr. S was, and how he had perfectly tried to mask all that wickedness under Mr. Nice and protective guy camouflage. He knew I was rounding off college and how focused I needed to be. Then he still decided to pull that stunt on me. To be honest, I was off balance. Even though I knew tenancy agreement laws, I was disappointed at how inconsiderate Mr. S had become for no just cause at all. I told him he couldn't just eject me from his property like that. I had a right to some month's notice, which he was so intentional about not granting. He made it clear that he didn't care about tenancy agreement laws and that all he needed me to do was vacate his property. He told me I could go to heck for all he cared. Even if I wanted to leave, I decided against it. I knew right then that I would dare him to do his worst. He couldn't force me out even if he owned the apartment. At least, I was sure of that in a civilized society. I knew I would see his worst part, but I was equally prepared for it. But I guess I didn't prepare enough, or should I say no one can prepare enough for toxicity. First, Mr. S made sure I couldn't bring anyone home to visit me because he scared them off with some scary Caucasian shepherd dogs, which he released at random. There were times I wondered if he thought he would go scot-free if one of his dogs injured my friends. But I guess none of my friends wanted to risk having to treat a dog bite, so they stayed out of my apartment. I could no longer live comfortably at home, so I spent the time off with my friends. I began to have to avoid Mr. S. Both of us went on like this for some time because I was determined not to leave his house. To be honest, my determination was a surprise to me too, because I knew how fragile I could be. A few weeks later, I thought Mr. S had come to terms with my strong resolve to not vacate his property since I'd only had a few months left. But one morning, he walked up to my apartment and reminded me I was meant to leave the previous month. I stood there, feigning confusion, but he was quick to shake me out of it. He made it very clear that he didn't want me to pay the rent for that month, and that if there was any time he was serious, it was then. I watched him leave my apartment as I quietly retraced my steps back in. I was contemplating packing my things and looking for a temporary space, but I knew that would have a toll on my academics since I had just 1 month to go. I shrugged, and I thought that Mr. S would have to be patient. When I made it to school that morning, my friends could see that I was lost in my world. Most of them advised me not to worry and that Mr. S would do nothing to me. Maybe I shouldn't have believed them the way I did. 7 days after Mr. S made it clear that he wanted me out at all costs, he decided to go all out against me. My exams were fast approaching, and I had intentionally stayed away from my apartment to avoid all forms of distraction. One day I needed to pick up some clothes for myself, so I rushed home because I wanted to be as fast as possible. I tried in my keys a couple of times, impatiently, if I must say. After a couple of tries, I realized that I couldn't open my door, and in fact, the lock had been changed. I experienced two things at the same time: anger and confusion. I was angry at Mr. S for choosing to be vengeful for no just cause. and I was confused as to how we both got to that point. I tried to remember all the good moments we've had together and how cordial we've been. I wondered why Mr. S didn't remember any memories at all, or if he did, he still chose to deal with me by letting him know I was an adult who wasn't obligated to obey all his instructions at all times. Well, I also chose the path of revenge. I knew Mr. S must have branded me weak or even underestimated me in some way, but I was going to teach him not to judge a book by its cover. It was obvious that I wouldn't have access to my apartment at that moment, so I left. I was glad I had my books with me so I didn't have to worry about what to read. With the help of my friends, I managed to lift my head high to finish strong. Unfortunately, I had 1 or 2 glitches in some courses, but that was enough to drive my quest to deal with Mr. S. I remember how many times I told him to give me some time, and he should consider how I was only a few months away from graduating. All I wanted was a sane mind and a peaceful apartment to return to, but Mr. S had other plans. I knew early on that there was no point in reporting Mr. S to the police because of his hardened nature. I knew he cared less about arrests and all that, so I knew well enough to handle him in my way. I knew well enough that Mr. S thrived the most in solitude, so I planned to take away his peace for a few days, at least. When I thought of the well-scripted plan to drive my agenda, I couldn't hold back a smile. Without wasting time, I decided to give a vivid snapshot of his beloved possession, his house, to some real estate websites and agents, stating that the house was for sale. I included his number, both his mobile and his home lines, since I had access to them. The intention was to have them blow up his phone with calls. I knew my plan worked when I visited his apartment, so he could allow me to get my things. I didn't know which was the funniest, the frustration on his face or the way his phones ring incessantly from his living room. I just don't know what I can do anymore, OP. It sounds like a darn call center in here. Well, if that's the case, consider my job well done. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. Now, if you want to hear another crazy revenge story, check out that video on the left. Or if you missed my latest video, check out that video on the right. That said, I'll see you all next time with some more stories.